Okay, good afternoon or good evening, actually. Uh, Today I'll be talking about high context and low context communicating styles. The title is High Context, Low Context, maybe High Drama. My name is Paulina Grzęda. I work at the University of SWPS in Warsaw, and this is part of the series of lectures that we prepared here at the university. So let me dive a little bit deeper into what I would like to talk about. So the core question for today's mini lecture is, how is that possible that we might communicate in clear English, but isn't always clear across cultures? Why do perfectly fluent English speakers still misunderstand each other? Yeah, grammar might be correct, vocabulary might be perfectly correct, but the conversation still creates a lot of confusion, right? Um, that's a common problem, and especially when we talk about global communication and speaking in global English, especially in business context, that's very often the case. Because intercultural communication competence, so being able to speak in global English, doesn't equal language skills. Perfectly you might have perfect, impeccable language skills, but not being familiar with certain cultural logic that is hidden under the words, you will not be able to communicate effectively across cultures, even using this impeccable English. So, mm, it is important to bear in mind that there are at least two communicating styles that have been discussed by many different researchers globally. Lately, Aaron Mayer's book, The Culture Map, has specified these communicating styles really nicely, and the core the core of this presentation and of this speech actually is based on Erin Mayer, the culture map and the culture dimensions that she has described in her book. And she divides cultures globally in just two categories: high context cultures that rely a lot on shared meaning, and low context cultures that rely on explicit meaning. What does it mean more specifically? Um, these are certain tendency. It's very important to remember that individuals will vary according to different communicating styles that they prefer, but patterns, cultural patterns, national patterns matter here. So we can generally broadly divide countries between low context and high context. On the low context end of the spectrum, we're going to have the US, which is probably considered to be one of the most low context countries. We will have also Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Germany, Finland, Denmark. The UK is way more high context than the US, as you can see here. Poland is somewhere in the middle, although leaning towards a low context communicating style. On the other end of the spectrum, we will have Japan, one of the highest context communicating culture, and Indonesia, Korea, Kenya, Saudi Arabia as well. There's gonna be a lot of Asian countries here, but also a lot of countries in the Middle East. So, what does it really mean that some countries are low context communicators and others are high context? Low context communication means that good communication in such countries is precise, it's very simple, and it's clear. And messages are generally expressed and understood at face value. That's why repetition, clarification is very appreciated because it will always help to clarify the communication, right? In high context cultures, on the other hand, good communication will be sophisticated, will be nuanced, will be multi-layered. It will imply that messages will be spoken, but also read between the lines. So there's a lot of reliance on body language, on reading between the lines, on paying attention to what was said, but also to what wasn't said, to the way it was said, to the body language that accompanied the conversation. That means that messages are very often implied, but not plainly expressed. This is not a face value kind of communication. And that means communicating styles that will belong to these high context cultures will depend on shared assumptions, on relationship, on nonverbal cues, right? There will be a lot that will be said in nonverbal ways. It's not only the verbal communication that matters. There's much deeper layer of nonverbal communication that needs to be taken into account. The meaning then will be implicit and will be very contextual. It will depend on the context a lot. And you could say that this is the type of culture in which you should know what I mean. I don't need to say it. You should guess. In low context communicating countries, on the other hand, the message is delivered with explicit meaning. A lot will depend on clarity, on explicit statements, on saying things directly, on clarifying things in emails, on asking for clarification. Meaning will be contained in the words themselves. And in this culture, you could say, if I didn't say it, I didn't mean it. If I meant something, I definitely said it. And that's how you should read these differences. Why does this matter for English? Why? Because even when two people speak perfect English, they will expect different levels of directness. And of course, different cultures have varying expectations regarding direct communication, and that affects clarity in conversations. And that can also lead to potential confusion. Different cultures will also interpret hints versus literal words differently. For example, high context speakers from countries like Japan or China will often rely on subtle hints, while low context speakers will communicate literally, causing potential misinterpretation during discussions. And people can also assign different meanings to tone, to pauses, to silence. So that's very important when you communicate. Why does it matter for English? There's another layer of meaning here because it also affects the English language itself, right? English language as a language that belongs to low context communicating countries, belongs or that is spoken by low context communicating countries, has more explicit vocabulary. Words tend to express meaning directly. It also has fewer homonyms, right? So polysemy, like double, triple meaning, is minimized. There is also a preference for precise terms, which means there is often creation of specialized vocabulary, very specialized, that is used in specific contexts and only in this context, like deadline, feedback, guidelines. It also impacts direct syntax because we have this very clear and not very flexible subject, verb, and object structure, and that is used for reinforcing clarity, basically. There is also expansion of modifiers, so adjectives and adverbs that frequently clarify meaning, such as exactly, specifically, clear. Low context languages have a tendency to use a lot of modifiers because that clarifies the context and the meaning. There is also explicit discourse markers such as connectors, like however, therefore, in contrast, those transition signals. They are often quite frequently used in low context languages as well. And there's lower tolerance for ambiguity. Of course, low context encourages more words to achieve clarity. And they are used as specific terms used in specific contexts. So there might be more vocabulary. And of course, it also impacts standardization, which means that dictionaries, grammar rules, and style guides that basically reinforces certain uniformity across different contexts. So that's how it affects English itself. And let me maybe give you a couple of examples so that it will be clear for you. One of the examples might be the so-called misleading maybe, right? In high context meaning, maybe might mean no. It will basically be said politely to protect the relationship or to maintain the harmony. In low context meaning, maybe means literally 50% chance, which is a literal assessment of possibility. And what does it create? It might create some misunderstandings, because the result will be that one person will think that they declined, and the other will think that that the option is still being considered, because there's literally 50% of chances that this will happen. Another example is the direct email that might be sent, and that's for example, in low context English email. If you read, please send the report by Friday, it is a very typical low context English email, very down to the point. High context interpretation, on the other hand, might be that it sounds cold, rude, and too bland. It doesn't really care about the relationship. There's no implication of a specific type of, let's say, the relationship behind this business context. And high context English email would sound more like this: like, "Hi, I hope your week is going well. If it's not too much trouble, could you maybe possibly send the report by Friday?" But that might be also confusing for low context communicators, because after reading an email like that, they will be asking themselves, so is Friday the deadline, or is it just a suggestion? Okay, a nice, polite email that takes into account the kind of relationship behind, but okay, the deadline or a suggestion? That's not clear, right? So you might be reading something so simple differently. Another thing is silence. In high context cultures, silence might be interpreted as respect, as a way of thinking about somebody, as an agreement, might be also understood as silent engagement, sometimes also as disagreement, politely withheld. A lot will depend on the context. In low context meanings, silence basically means no input, lack of engagement, or maybe that something is wrong. But as you can see, the meaning is much less multi-layered. Another example is humor, and that's also an important example, I think, because low context and high context does impact the way we laugh and how and what we laugh at. For example, the UK, as the country that is way more high context than the US, relies in humor on irony, sarcasm, understatements, more deadpan, and it's way more nuanced. And I think this is something, this Black British humor is something that we are quite familiar with. And in Poland, for example, as people who come from a country that communicates somewhere in between high context and low context and high context, we prefer British humor because it's closer to our communicating style. American humor relies, on the other hand, on clarity, direct punchlines, and very explicit setup. And for many, and also for us very often, is too flat, too explicit. So that's another example. I said that there might be some high drama moments. Why? Because it will create, not being familiar with the fact that there's low context and high context, it will create mixed signals. Low context individuals may interpret indirect cues as unclear intentions, and that can lead to feeling of confusion or frustration. That might also create a feeling like feeling bland, right? High context individuals will often perceive straightforwardness as rudeness, as being blunt. And that can cause emotional discomfort, right? And it can even create some defensiveness in communication. So people on both sides can engage in something that is called blame game. Both will feel misunderstood, and both will think that it's the other that is the unclear communicator. And there will be this, spiral of blaming each other. We don't want that. There is one thing that is really important to remember about. Global English isn't neutral. Global English often prioritizes low context communication. Most international English norms will follow the low context logic. So you will be expected to say what you mean. You will be expected to be clear and direct. You will be expected to be specific, to be linear, and all that basically to avoid ambiguity. And especially in business, this low context communicating norms are very encouraged due to the impact of American culture sphere on global business. So we have adapted globally already all the business communication rules that come from the US, like 3 times tell them. So at the beginning of a speech, you basically say what you're going to talk about, then you say it, and then at the end you recap everything, just saying what you've just said. So this is the 3 times tell them rule, and that's adapted in global business meetings. Pretty much everywhere. Recapping meetings, key takeaways in emails is another American, let's say, technique or way of doing things that comes from this low context communicating style. And of course, frequent repetition and clarification that is often requested and that is often encouraged in business. This also comes from low context communicating style. So where does it come from and what does it impact? You could probably notice looking at the countries that are low context communicators. Let me go back clearly to the list of the countries. You can see the US, Australia, Canada, so the Anglo-Saxon countries, but those that had historically huge influx of immigrants are very low context. On the other hand, we've got countries that are high context like Japan, China, India, Iran, Korea, Indonesia. So, for example, Japan, that has a very long history of isolationism, you might be able to notice that there are certain, let's say, that there is this element of historical continuity. Countries with long and stable histories will tend to rely on the shared meaning, shared context. And there's a long, stable history of shared context. So they will rely on high context communication. On the other hand, countries that have frequent disruptions, rapid social changes, revolutions, lots of immigrants coming, will depend on low context communication. So that also leads us to social diversity or cultural diversity. Homogeneous societies generally are more of high context countries. Diverse and multicultural societies that are very heterogeneous, like the US, like Australia, where citizens from countries from all over the world basically had to coexist together and had to learn each other's different, sometimes very different communicating styles, basically develop this low context communication to clarify, to be able to communicate, right? To be able to create something common. And that's where it comes from. Of course, there's also influence of educational systems, and all those countries that encourage debate, argumentation, and clarity tend to have low context communicating style. Those that depend way more on harmony and group cohesion and implicit understanding will belong to high context communicating countries. And if we have a look at this, another kind of culture dimension, so individuals versus collectivism, generally individualist cultures tend to have low context communicating styles, whereas collectivist cultures, like Japan again, will definitely have this high context, relational, indirect communication style. What can you do? You basically need to develop cultural sensitivity, and this is essential for effective global English communication. So you basically need to know about it and need to pay attention to it and need to bear it in mind and take it into account when you communicate with people. If you talk to low context communicators, so let's say Americans, but also people in Germany or Denmark or the Netherlands, be explicit, clarify your expectations, whatever you expect, deadlines, decisions, responsibilities. Use fewer hints and more specifics. Also, clarify and always ask for clarifications. Listen to the verbal cues only. Yeah? Don't assume that there is meaning behind those verbal cues. Also, state disagreements directly, but politely, but be direct. If you disagree, make sure that you let people know. Don't be afraid of repetition. They will expect you to repeat. So do repeat. Summarize next steps clearly. That's another thing. Always use summaries, synthesizing, and different ways of repeating what was already said. Anything that will help you clarify the communication. What else can you do here when you speak to high context communicators? On the other hand, you have to read tone and relationship cues. You need to pay attention to warmth, to politeness levels, to different levels of formality, different hierarchical rules. You will also have to listen for indirect messages, for pauses, phrasing, and hedging. You will need to watch body language. You will need to watch facial expressions and the context, right? As the Japanese say, you will need to be reading the air, the atmosphere, whatever is not said, whatever kind of meaning is conveyed underneath what is verbal. So you will have to notice what is not said. Also, do not repeat yourself because it may feel rude or patronizing. You can also use softer language, like maybe we could consider rather than saying just a plain no. Always maintain relational harmony before task clarity, so that's also very important. And always remember about some hierarchy cues. So make sure that you are allowed to speak first, right? Pay attention to all those subtle cues that will be visible in the context. So what are the key takeaways? High context versus low context styles shape how we give feedback, how we say no, yes, or maybe, how we show respect to people, what we laugh at, how we interpret politeness, and generally how we understand English itself, especially when we're talking about global English. Remember, there's no right style, there's just different cultural logics. So, just remember that to communicate clearly across cultures, don't just listen to the English, listen to the context that's underneath it. Thank you very much.